Ambassador Betty Pavelich, welcome to Europe Now.
Thank you, Anthony. Great to be back in Adelaide and great to see you again.
We're delighted that you could come and join us. Ambassador, all talk is about coronavirus, and that looks set to continue into 2021. 2020 has seen a world under siege as a result of COVID-19. I'm wondering what's the current situation in Croatia and how you think the country is currently faring, both in terms of public health and also in terms of the economy as a result of the COVID-19 crisis.
Well, COVID-19 has definitely thrown the world for a loop. Croatia and the entire EU have been coping as best as we can. During the first wave, we had done quite well. We went into a lockdown and our results were quite good. Unfortunately, now we are in a second wave, and that is proving a little more challenging as we enter winter. And the government is doing the best that it can. We are not looking at another lockdown. We are trying to manage. There's mandatory masks. School is still functioning. The economy is still functioning. We were fortunate that in that first wave, by June, we were down to 0 cases, and we reopened our borders. Given that tourism is such a key component of our economy, we were able to actually salvage a tourism season this year, which resulted in about 50% of the results that we had the year prior. So close to 8 million tourists managed to visit Croatia, even during COVID. I believe we had 49 million overnight stays. Which is quite significant. We had the best performance in the entire Mediterranean as far as tourism goes. Oddly enough, tourists were not responsible for that second wave. It was literally, I think, just as we entered the fall season. We also didn't have restrictions on gatherings, on weddings, funerals, that type of thing. So most of the transmission was actually community transmission. But now as we enter the new phase, we are looking to a lot of the EU funding that's being put in place for the recovery that will help us through, and hopefully our economy won't be as badly affected as we had initially thought.
Yes, so on that, I mean, earlier this year the EU did unveil this 750 billion recovery package for the coronavirus pandemic, which actually takes EU total spending in response to the pandemic now into the trillions of euros. How has Croatia been contributing to that European-wide effort to fight the pandemic and, I think importantly, to fight it on global terms?
Well, if I can back up perhaps to the fund, Croatia actually held the presidency of the Council of the European Union during the first half of 2020. So we took that over in January the 1st, and we were plugging along quite well. Even in February, when we started negotiating the multi-annual financial framework, we had managed to also set the parameters for an orderly Brexit, shall we say, and then March and COVID hit. And we were also then hit by a 5.3 magnitude earthquake in the middle of our lockdown. So we had actually been helping countries in the region who were struggling as a result of COVID. We had the supplies that we needed. We were able to actually secure the supplies that we needed from around the world, including from China, and we were able to share in that respect. The EU has been working as a whole to address COVID. Even though freedom of movement was somewhat impacted during the height, I guess, of the pandemic, we've been working together to try to find ways to mitigate a lot of those challenges, including, working with our EU colleagues and globally to find a cure. to find a vaccine for COVID, which we hope will come on board sometime in the new year.
Climate change has been near top of the political agenda in Europe over recent years. Although more recently with this pandemic there have been claims and counterclaims that that COVID-19 has now impacted the capacity of the EU to achieve a climate neutral Europe. Most recently the EC president has said no, things are good, we're on track for EU to be carbon neutral by 2050, that's the ambition. And again, very recently, the European Council considered the Stepping Up Europe's 2030 Climate Ambition communication, which sets out an emissions reduction target of up to 55% by the year 2030. What actions are Croatia taking to achieve these climate change developments?
So Croatia is first and foremost already at its 2020 targets. Actually, we've exceeded our 2020 targets, and we're on track to meet the 2050 targets by 2030. 28% of our energy comes from renewable energy sources as it is right now. And we're quite focused on our environment, specifically because we rely on our Adriatic Sea for a prime source of our economy, tourism, for our fisheries. We pride ourselves on the cleanliness of our seas and are specifically focused on maintaining and protecting that biodiversity, specifically our oceans and our environment. We are a biodiversity hotspot in Europe. We are number 3 in terms of water resources, freshwater resources per capita in the EU. And we also pride ourselves on the quality of our food. We don't even allow genetically modified organisms into Croatia. So we're definitely focused on our natural environment. We have actually every year suffered from forest fires, something similar to what Australia faces here, and bushfires. Oddly enough, we found that this summer we barely had any. So was that the result of, we're not entirely sure, but did COVID play its part? Was that because of the reduced numbers? What was the cause of that? But it was probably the best forest fire season that we've had since we can remember. We continue to rejuvenate our biodiversity, replanting, and generally protecting the environment. So it's something that is a priority for us, as well as the EU. We as the EU, we also find that we're not just talking the talk on climate change, we are walking the walk. And we're encouraging others to do so. There was a recent meeting of EU leaders with the Chinese president, and we've secured a commitment from China to actually have their carbon neutral goals by 2060. So we think the environment has not been ignored during COVID, and a lot of the funding that is coming through the recovery program is actually earmarked for environmental projects, as well as digitalisation and a number of other priority areas.
Right. We'll come to digitalisation in a moment. Freedom of movement has been a cornerstone of EU citizenship, enshrined, of course, in the Maastricht Treaty and the Treaty of Rome. And now COVID-19 seems to have, again, profoundly challenged mobility rights due to restrictions based on public health concerns. I'm wondering how you think the EU has fared in navigating this remarkably tricky terrain, and whether any future actions might be necessary to sort of protect freedom of movement, this fundamental right within EU citizenship.
Well, it's definitely been a challenging period for freedom of movement. I can speak to Croatia in that our borders remained open Europeans were able to travel freely and without quarantine. The same is actually true for third country nationals. So if an Australian were to come to Croatia today, he or she would not have to quarantine if they could provide proof of a that they were COVID-free based on a PCR test that was no older than 48 hours. The EU has just actually come out with some new guidelines to try to address some of the challenges that we have faced. For instance, if you're a student and you live in Zagreb, but you're studying in Brussels, now you will be able to travel without quarantine because what you're doing is essential to your lifestyle. The same goes for business. The same goes for if you are going to a funeral in another member state. So while there were hiccups at the beginning of COVID, those have now been mitigated with some new measures that all of the EU has agreed to.
Let's turn to the economy. Lots of talk about free trade agreements everywhere. And while the EU has been busy negotiating and renegotiating again with the UK on the post-Brexit free trade agreements, and we're going to see where all that leads to. Discussion here, of course, about the free trade agreement between Australia and the EU. Some of your ambassadorial colleagues on this very program have been telling us that they think there's great promise ahead for free trade agreement in 2021. How do you view this, and what do you see as the likely signs for success at the moment?
I think it's encouraging that even through COVID, we've been able to continue with the negotiations between Australia and the EU. We completed the 8th round just at the end of September. The 9th round is scheduled for December. Well, I think that's very encouraging. I think if COVID has shown us anything, it's that we all need to work together. We need to find new ways to connect economically, and trade is definitely going to help us all move forward economically in this post-COVID environment. As you know, Anthony, I mean, there are so many connections between Europe and Australia. We have so many communities here, my own community here in South Australia, very vibrant Croatian community, many others, Italians, Portuguese, French, German. So I think there's definitely a lot of interest and a lot of opportunity. The EU is Australia's 3rd largest trading partner, whereas Australia, I think, comes in at 19th place for us. So $50 billion euros, sorry, but I think there's definitely room to grow. There's some things that we still need to work on. I hope that we'll be able to get those resolved. I know that for a number of EU member states, there are 10 of us in total that do not have double taxation agreements with Australia, and that is something that moving forward we'll be looking to amend before we can conclude negotiations as well. We put great priority on a level playing field for all EU member states, and I think anyone negotiating with the European Union needs to keep that in mind. We are 27 nations who expect equal treatment from all those that we partner with, be they in trade agreements or others.
Digitalisation, of course, has become increasingly central to modern economies and societies, and arguably the pandemic has accelerated the entire digital revolution. You see some really, I think, massive economic transformations unfolding over recent months. The whole trend towards remote working, digital workstations and so on and so forth. But even at an institutional level, if you look at really large-scale organizations and multinationals, a company like ExxonMobil, once one of the most valuable companies in the US, now doesn't even make it into the top 30. Meanwhile, Zoom has now become a household name in a relatively short space of time. This has led some critics to suggest that in the same way there was a kind of climate emergency declared across Europe, maybe there should be a digital emergency now called throughout the world. I'm wondering, Ambassador, what kind of score would you give the EU in terms of the way these challenges have been addressed, the challenges of digitalisation? If you look across Europe, really broad-ranging challenges in terms of things like the shift from 4G to 5G networks, developments in artificial intelligence, and obviously very interested in the perspective from the standpoint of Croatia.
Well, I think, again, I think the EU has demonstrated that it's up to the task on digitalization. The recovery funding that's been announced, 30% of that is actually earmarked for digitalization to advance the footprint that we're already at, and specifically for artificial intelligence.
Right.
Issues like 5G, improving our capacity. In that is also sort of a goal to debunk some myths about the 5G. There have been some mixed messages about 5G that haven't necessarily been accurate, so we'll be working towards that. But for instance, as I mentioned to you, Croatia held the presidency for the first part of 2020, and we actually had to move entirely to a digital footprint instead of having 1,400 meetings in Brussels and 200 meetings in Zagreb.
Right.
We ended up having 50 ministerial meetings digitally. So,
gosh,
I think the fact that we were able to shift so quickly actually is a testament to how well we are doing. And I know for Croatia, for instance, we've had a number of IT companies that have just done remarkably well during COVID. We've had our first unicorn with Infobip that's getting ready to go public in New York. And these are companies that produce the technology for WhatsApp and Viber, and that we wouldn't have been able to survive without these past 10 months.
Right. In respect of as you noted, the Croatia having the presidency of the Council of the EU in the earlier part of the year, a vision of Europe was promoted by Croatia, focusing on a Europe that develops, that connects, that protects, and is influential. Just wondering, upon reflection, your thoughts on those ambitions, and in particular what Croatia brought to the development of EU integration. Because, obviously such a challenging time to have the presidency.
Well, the actual motto for our presidency was a strong Europe in a world of global challenges. And
so you certainly found
who could have even thought that we would probably have one of the greatest challenges facing the world when COVID hit. So, I think when we look at a Europe that protects, let's talk about how we protected our citizens that were trapped globally. We managed to return more than 625,000 Europeans to Europe through our joint efforts, consular coordination. As you know, as it's frequently talked about here in the press, it's been hard getting Australians home, and there's still many thousands at home. I can tell you that here on the ground, with incredible coordination among the member states out of Canberra, we were able to get almost 50,000 Europeans home from Australia alone. Working with partners such as Qatar Airways, coordinating repatriation flights, always ensuring that there was room on flights for every other member state's citizens. So we did manage to protect our citizens abroad. We also protected our citizens internally by sharing medical supplies, by really with the funding to help every country mitigate the economic challenges that we faced, plus assisting those globally who needed our help, be it with either medical equipment, be it financially, and all the while trying to also deal with some of the global challenges. We had 2 high-level meetings on Syria during the presidency. We managed to host, I think, something that was sort of our key priority, the Zagreb Summit, 20 years, Zagreb Summit on the Western Balkans, 20 years after the first EU summit on that agenda. We managed to open accession negotiations with Northern Macedonia and Albania. These were priorities for us, so we kept things moving, and I think all of that also lays the foundation for the future of Europe.
Finally, Betty, I'd like to switch lenses here and ask you something about your time in Australia as ambassador and with your staff at the embassy, to ask you to tell us a little bit about the work that's done there at the embassy, and I mean, again, in these very challenging times, how that has looked this year.
Well, we had a big agenda planned for 2020. This was going to be the year not only of our EU presidency, which had come less than 30 years after Croatian independence, after we had successfully won the homeland war, reintegrated all of our territory, joined NATO in 2009, joined the EU in 2013. We were going to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the building of the Croatian embassy in Canberra, which was given to us as a gift by the Croatian community here in Australia and New Zealand. So we had a lot of plans, and that was all overtaken by COVID. It was all overtaken by consular work primarily, getting our nationals and the nationals of other EU member states home to Europe, helping those maybe young students who were stuck here. There were a lot of challenges for a number of students, international students across Australia, as I'm sure you know. But in that whole time, we've continued to maintain a very close relationship throughout this crisis with the Croatian community. And they are, first and foremost, I want to say our core business, because the strong Croatian community across Australia, and they are everywhere, is actually the most important bond that Croatia shares with Australia. Our numbers indicate about 250,000 Australians of Croatian heritage. They are our largest investors. They frequently visit Croatia. Many still have family and homes there. So they are a very integral part of our everyday business, shall we say. We also have a number of Catholic missions across the country. And so I think we've continued to try to maintain those relationships as best as we can. I had initiated a Croatian Women in Leadership initiative last year. We had a summit at the embassy with 100 women from across Australia and New Zealand. When COVID hit, we went virtual. So we meet monthly online, sharing experiences, profiling successful women from across Australia and New Zealand, connecting with other women in Croatia, some of whom are from Australia, who have moved back, who have started businesses. So we've had to change the way we do business, but while still trying to maintain that connection with our community. And we're hoping that trade, once the free trade agreement is concluded, that we'll be able to pick up. And once your borders are open again, that Australians will be able to come back to Croatia, because we had, I would say, close to 200,000 visitors from Australia pre-COVID. That's significantly fallen now. But as soon as you're allowed to travel, we hope you'll all be able to come back.
And just in terms of not only the work ahead of you in the coming years, but if I could ask you to look through your ambassadorial crystal ball, what would be your hopes for the development and deepening of relations between Australia and Croatia?
Well, I think relations between Australia and Croatia are already very good. I would like to see greater exchanges at our political levels. I think it's been quite some time since we've had some ministerial level visits. We did have the former president of Croatia visit in 2017, but there's been a bit of a lull since then. So I do hope that once borders are open that we can get some ministerial level visits coming. I also should note that in 2021, Croatia, in partnership with the Netherlands, will become the NATO contact point embassy for Australia. So we'll be looking to see how we can work more closely together in the field of defense cooperation. I think this is something really important, not just for Croatia in Europe, but for Australia as well. And I think there's, even though our relationship is great, I think there's always more that can be done, and our community is keen to see that happen, and so are we.
Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us on Europe Now.
Thank you so much.